On our family trip, my husband sneered, "I booked rooms for me, my ex-girlfriend, and the kids, they're my real love." I smiled sweetly, said nothing, and walked away. Hours passed as I ignored every call. Then something he never expected happened, and it was only the beginning of my silence. "I booked rooms for me, Camille, and the kids." Eric's words hit me like ice water. "Not for you." I stood frozen in the marble lobby of the Grand Ocean View Resort, our luggage scattered around my feet like broken dreams. The tropical paradise I'd researched for months, the family vacation I'd planned down to every detail, suddenly felt like a cruel joke. The sound of crashing waves through the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed to mock the silence that followed his announcement. "What?" The word barely escaped my lips, a whisper lost in the resort's ambient music. Eric didn't even look at me. He was too busy checking his phone, that familiar cold indifference painted across his face. "You heard me, Jennifer. 3 rooms. Me, Camille, and 1 for the kids to share." Camille appeared from the gift shop like she'd been choreographing this moment. Her blonde hair cascaded perfectly over her shoulders, her designer sundress fitting her like it was painted on. She walked toward us with the confidence of someone who belonged, while I stood there feeling like an intruder in my own family vacation. "Eric, darling," she purred, sliding her manicured hand along his arm. "Did you tell her about the arrangements?" The lobby suddenly felt suffocating. Families chatted excitedly around us. Children giggled as they ran toward the pool. Couples held hands while checking in. Everyone looked like they belonged in this picture-perfect scene. Everyone except me. "Mom." Charity's small voice cut through the tension. At 8 years old, she was the youngest, still young enough to sense when something was wrong but not old enough to understand the adult games being played around her. "Where are we sleeping?" Chase, my 14-year-old, shifted uncomfortably beside his little sister. His eyes darted between his father and me, the weight of loyalty pressing down on his teenage shoulders. Jeffrey, at 16, had learned to retreat into his phone during these moments, but I caught him glancing up, watching. "Your mom will figure something out," Eric said dismissively, signing the registration paperwork with theatrical flourishes. "She's resourceful." Camille extended her designer purse toward me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Be a dear and take this up for me? Room 412. She spoke to me like I was hired help, her voice dripping with fake sweetness that made my skin crawl. I stared at the purse for a moment that stretched like eternity. Every instinct screamed at me to throw it back at her, to cause a scene, to fight for my dignity in this marble-clad battlefield. That I took it. The leather felt cold against my palms. "Jennifer's always been so helpful," Eric said to Camille, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "She loves taking care of everyone else's needs." The children watched this exchange with growing discomfort. Charity tugged at my dress, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. Chase cleared his throat awkwardly. Jeffrey typed faster on his phone, his face reddening. At dinner, the resort's 5-star restaurant became my personal hell. The maitre d' had seated us at a prime ocean view table, the kind I'd specifically requested months ago when booking this trip. Camille sat beside Eric, her hand possessively resting on his thigh while she ordered the most expensive items on the menu. "You know what Jennifer is?" Eric announced to our table, his voice carrying that familiar tone he used when he thought he was being clever. "She's like extra luggage. Always there, always taking up space, but you're never quite sure why you brought her along." The words landed like physical blows. Chase choked on his water. Charity looked confused, glancing between her father and me. Jeffrey's fork stopped midway to his mouth. Even nearby diners turned to look, sensing the cruelty in Eric's tone. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, that familiar burn of humiliation that had become too frequent in recent months. The other families around us were laughing, sharing stories, creating memories. We were performing a twisted theater piece where I was the unwilling tragic character. "Dad." Chase started, his voice cracking slightly. "What?" Eric laughed, cutting him off. "It's just a joke. Your mom knows I'm kidding." He looked at me expectantly, waiting for me to play along, to smile and laugh at my own degradation. I didn't smile. I didn't laugh. I didn't speak. Instead, I placed my napkin on the table with deliberate precision. I stood slowly, feeling every eye at the table follow my movement. The restaurant's ambient chatter seemed to fade as I pushed back my chair. "Where are you going?" Eric's voice carried a note of surprise. He wasn't used to me leaving without explanation, without permission. I looked at him for a long moment, memorizing his face, the way his eyebrows furrowed with confusion, the way Camille's hand tightened possessively on his arm. I looked at my children, their faces reflecting worry and embarrassment and something else. Maybe respect. Then I walked away. My phone started ringing before I even reached the lobby. Eric's name flashed on the screen again and again. I let it ring. In the elevator it rang. Walking down the hallway to my hastily booked room it rang. As I slid the key card and stepped into my sanctuary, it continued its desperate song. I powered it off. Alone in the quiet luxury of my ocean view suite, paid for with my own credit card, I opened my laptop. The familiar glow of the screen illuminated my face as I logged into our financial accounts. The ones Eric assumed he controlled, the ones he'd forgotten were actually in my name. As I scrolled through investment portfolios, business accounts, and property deeds, I realized something profound. Eric had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He'd pushed me too far, humiliated me too publicly, forgotten too completely who actually held the power in our relationship. My silence tonight wouldn't be weakness. It would be strategy. The laptop screen glowed in the darkness of my hotel room as I began dismantling 12 years of financial entanglement. My fingers moved across the keyboard with surgical precision, each keystroke calculated and deliberate. Eric had always bragged about being the breadwinner, the business mastermind, the financial genius of our household. What he'd conveniently forgotten was that I held the actual keys to the kingdom. I started with the investment portfolio. $73,000 in mutual funds, transferred to my personal account. The real estate holdings came next. Our vacation rental properties in Colorado, the ones Eric loved to mention at dinner parties as his investments, were actually titled under my name for tax purposes. I initiated the paperwork to convert them to my sole ownership. The business accounts proved more complex but not impossible. Eric's consulting firm, the source of his endless ego trips, operated under an LLC I'd established years ago. He'd been so focused on playing the big shot that he'd never bothered to examine the legal documents I'd prepared. Every signature, every filing, every crucial piece of paperwork had been handled by me while he schmoozed clients and took credit. My phone buzzed with another missed call from Eric. 27 attempts since dinner. I glanced at the screen and powered it off completely. At 11:47 p.m., I dialed my attorney's emergency line. Margaret Chin had been our family lawyer for years, but tonight she was solely mine. Jennifer? What's happening? It's nearly midnight. Margaret, I need to file for legal separation. Tonight. Can you start the paperwork? Her voice sharpened with professional focus. Tell me everything. I recounted the evening's humiliation, the calculated cruelty, the way Eric had paraded his affair partner like a trophy while reducing me to hired help. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes. We'll need documentation of financial assets, evidence of emotional abuse, and a comprehensive separation agreement, she said. How quickly do you want to move? Immediately. I want him served before he realizes what's happening. Jennifer, this is a significant step. Are you certain? I looked around the hotel room I'd booked with my own credit card, thought about the purse I'd carried like a servant, remembered the laughter at my expense. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. Margaret's fingers clicked across her keyboard. I'll have preliminary documents ready by morning. We'll start with asset protection, then move to formal separation proceedings. While Margaret worked through the night, I continued my methodical financial restructuring. The joint credit cards were canceled one by one. The automatic payments Eric relied on for everything from his gym membership to his expensive car lease were redirected to accounts he couldn't access. By 3 a.m., I'd effectively frozen him out of the financial empire I'd built while he played pretend Sue. Dawn crept through the hotel curtains as I packed my belongings. My phone, now equipped with a new number, remained blissfully silent. No desperate calls from Eric. No manipulative text messages. No attempts to gaslight me back into submission. The resort lobby buzzed with checkout activity. Families dragged rolling suitcases toward the entrance. Children complained about leaving paradise. Couples discussed their flights home. I positioned myself strategically near the front desk, close enough to observe but far enough to remain unnoticed. Eric appeared first, his hair disheveled, dark circles under his eyes. He looked like he'd spent the night pacing and calling. Camille followed, her previous confidence replaced by irritated confusion. The children trailed behind, their faces reflecting the tension they'd absorbed overnight. "Sir, I'm sorry, but your card has been declined," the desk clerk said, her voice professionally apologetic. Eric's face flushed crimson. "That's impossible. Try it again." The clerk swiped the card a second time, then a third. Each attempt produced the same result. "Declined. Insufficient funds. Perhaps you have another card?" she suggested gently. Camille stepped forward, her designer purse clutched defensively. "Use mine," she whispered, but her voice carried across the marble lobby. Eric's humiliation deepened as Camille's card also failed to cover the substantial resort bill. 3 rooms for 4 nights, plus meals, spa treatments and room service charges. I'd witnessed them accumulating. "There must be some mistake," Eric insisted, his voice rising. Other guests began to stare. "I'm a successful businessman. This is impossible." The desk clerk maintained her professional composure while security subtly positioned themselves nearby. "Sir, would you like to contact your bank?" I watched from my position near the gift shop as Eric fumbled with his phone, dialing frantically. His conversation with the bank was brief and clearly devastating. His face went ashen as he listened to explanations he couldn't comprehend. The children stood together, embarrassed by their father's public meltdown. Chase put a protective arm around Charity, while Jeffrey studied his shoes intently. "Mom paid the bill last night," I heard Jeffrey tell his siblings quietly. "I saw her at the desk." I had indeed paid the full bill, with my personal credit card, the one Eric had never bothered to learn existed. $23,000 for a family vacation that had cost me far more than money. As Eric continued his humiliating negotiation with hotel management, I wheeled my luggage toward the taxi stand. The morning sun felt warm on my face. The ocean breeze carried promises of freedom I hadn't felt in years. My new phone contained Margaret's message: "Separation papers filed. Service scheduled for this afternoon at his office." I climbed into the taxi without looking back, leaving Eric to discover that the woman he'd treated as extra luggage had been carrying far more weight than he'd ever imagined. By the time he thought to look for me, Jennifer Morrison would no longer exist in his world. The silence I'd chosen the night before had become something far more powerful than words ever could be. 3 days after returning to my temporary apartment, I sat at my kitchen table with 3 blank envelopes and a heart heavy with love that had nowhere to go. The silence I'd maintained felt necessary, but my children deserved more than abandonment. They deserved to understand the mother who had disappeared from their lives. I started with Charity's letter first, my 8-year-old who still believed in fairy tales and happy endings. My handwriting trembled as I wrote about the morning she'd broken her arm falling from her bike. How I'd held her in the emergency room for 6 hours, singing "You Are My Sunshine," until the pain medication finally let her sleep. I reminded her of the purple cast we'd decorated together with butterfly stickers, how she'd insisted on wearing it like a badge of honor. Carefully, I slipped her old drawing into the envelope, the one she'd made for Mother's Day 2 years ago. Stick figures holding hands under a rainbow, with "Best ever" written in wobbly crayon letters. I'd kept it pressed between the pages of my Bible, one of dozens of treasures Eric had dismissed as clutter. Chase's letter required different words. At 14, he was caught between childhood and becoming a man, desperately seeking his father's approval while still needing his mother's guidance. I wrote about the night he'd failed his first algebra test, how we'd sat at this same kitchen table until 2 a.m., working through problems until mathematics finally clicked. I reminded him of his first football game, when he'd scored the winning touchdown and searched the bleachers until he found my face, needing that moment of shared triumph. Into his envelope went his 8th grade report card, the one I'd laminated because I was so proud of his straight A's. Eric had barely glanced at it, too busy with a client call to notice his son's academic breakthrough. Jeffrey's letter proved the most challenging. At 16, he was already building walls, preparing for the independence that loomed ahead. But I remembered the boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who'd practiced his pitching motion in our backyard for hours while I caught every throw. I wrote about his first broken heart, when Melissa Harper had chosen someone else for the school dance. How he'd cried on my shoulder while I made his favorite chocolate chip cookies and promised him that someday a girl would see what an amazing young man he was becoming. His baseball glove went into the envelope, the one from Little League that he'd outgrown but couldn't bear to throw away. I'd found it in his closet during one of my secret visits to pack more belongings, tucked behind his trophies like a shrine to simpler times. I drove to their school and hand-delivered each letter to the main office, asking Mrs. Henderson, the secretary who'd known our family for years, to ensure they reached my children personally. "Jennifer, honey," she said, her eyes filled with concern. "Are you all right? The kids have been asking about you." "They'll understand soon," I whispered, my voice barely holding together. Within days, the carefully constructed harmony Eric and Camille had tried to create began cracking. Chase called me from his friend's phone. Eric had confiscated his cell after finding my letter. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he sobbed into the phone. "I didn't know. I didn't understand what you did for us. You were children, sweetheart. You weren't supposed to understand. That was my job." Through Chase, I learned about the chaos erupting at home. Camille had moved in completely, rearranging furniture, throwing away family photos, trying to erase my presence while establishing her own dominance. But children don't forget so easily. Jeffrey had found more of my hidden treasures during his search for clean clothes. A journal I'd kept documenting each of their milestones, photos from every birthday party I'd planned, certificates I'd earned from parenting classes I'd taken to be better for them. Each discovery revealed layers of maternal devotion they'd taken for granted. "She doesn't listen to us like you did," Chase whispered during another stolen phone call. "When Charity has nightmares, Camille just tells her to grow up. When Jeffrey talks about college, she changes the subject. She talks at us, not to us." The house that had once been filled with my quiet presence, packed lunches appearing like magic, homework help offered without request, scraped knees kissed better, now echoed with tension. Camille's shrill voice replaced my gentle guidance. Her impatience replaced my endless reserves of maternal energy. "Dad keeps bragging about how much simpler everything is now," Jeffrey told me during a brief encounter at the grocery store. "But nothing works anymore. There's no food in the house because nobody planned meals. My baseball uniform wasn't clean for yesterday's game. Charity cried for an hour because she couldn't find her favorite stuffed animal. The stuffed animal was in my apartment. I'd grabbed it during one of my packing trips, knowing she'd need its comfort." "Mom," Jeffrey's voice cracked slightly. "Can you come back? Just for Charity? She asks for you every night." My heart shattered and mended simultaneously. They were beginning to see what Eric had systematically tried to make invisible. The countless ways I'd held their world together through love, attention, and sacrifice. The breaking point came during Chase's championship basketball game. I watched from the parking lot as Eric and Camille arrived late, too busy arguing to notice Chase scanning the bleachers for familiar faces. When he made the winning shot, his eyes found the empty space where I used to sit, where I'd cheered at every game for 3 seasons. That night, Charity's small voice cut through the darkness of their disrupted home. "I want Mama, Jennifer." Even through Chase's whispered phone call, I could hear the profound silence that followed. Eric had no response. Camille offered no comfort. In that moment, my absence spoke louder than any argument I could have made. My children were finally seeing the mother they'd forgotten, not through my presence, but through the devastating emptiness left behind. The process server found Eric at his favorite coffee shop, the upscale place where he held his Tuesday morning power meetings. I'd told Margaret exactly where he'd be, same table, same time every week for the past 3 years. His predictability had always annoyed me, now it served my purposes perfectly. "Eric Morrison?" The young man in the cheap suit approached his table where Eric sat across from a potential client, his laptop open, projecting success like a peacock displaying its feathers. "Yes." Eric's voice carried that familiar tone of superiority, assuming this interruption was someone seeking his business expertise. "You've been served." The manila envelope landed on Eric's laptop keyboard with a soft thud that somehow echoed through the bustling cafe. His client, a nervous-looking woman clutching a business proposal, watched with growing alarm as Eric's face drained of color. Margaret's legal documents were thorough and devastating. Asset freeze. Business dissolution. Legal separation. Every financial account tied to my name, which was nearly everything, had been systematically locked away from his access. The consulting firm he'd bragged about building was revealed for what it truly was. A shell company operating under my credentials, my connections, my credit history. "This can't be legal," Eric whispered to himself, scanning the pages with growing horror. His client gathered her papers and left without a word, sensing the professional meeting had taken a decidedly personal turn. Within hours, Eric discovered the true scope of his powerlessness. His business credit cards were declined at lunch. His corporate gym membership had been suspended for non-payment. The leased BMW he drove like a status symbol was scheduled for repossession. I'd been making those payments from my personal account for 18 months. Camille arrived at his office that afternoon in a panic, her designer heels clicking frantically across the marble floor of the building I'd helped him lease. "Eric, what is happening?" she demanded, waving her phone. "My credit card was declined at Nordstrom. The bank says there's been suspicious activity on our joint account." "Our joint account?" Eric's laugh held no humor. "Camille, we don't have a joint account. We never did." I watched this unfold through Jeffrey, who'd been present when Camille tore through Eric's home office like a woman possessed. She discovered what I'd always known but never flaunted. Every deed, every contract, every significant asset bore my name as the primary owner. Eric had been living in a house I'd purchased, driving cars I'd financed, running a business built on credit I'd established. "She made me look like an idiot," Eric raged to his brother over the phone, unaware that Jeffrey was listening from the hallway. "Everything I thought I owned, everything I built, it's all hers." But the financial devastation was only the beginning of Eric's unraveling. The children, emboldened by my letters and increasingly resentful of Camille's presence, began their own archaeological dig through family history. Chase found a box of photo albums in the basement, buried behind Christmas decorations that hadn't been touched since I'd disappeared. Every page told the same story. Me at his soccer games, me helping with science fair projects, me holding him in the hospital when he'd had his appendix removed at age 10. Eric appeared sporadically, usually in the background, often looking at his phone. "Look at this." Chase showed Jeffrey a picture from his 13th birthday party. I was kneeling beside him as he blew out candles, my face radiant with maternal pride. Eric stood apart, checking his watch, already eager to end the celebration. Charity discovered her baby book, meticulously maintained with my careful handwriting documenting every milestone. First smile, first word, first steps, all recorded with the devotion of a mother who treasured each moment. Eric's contributions were sparse. A few signatures on school forms, birthday cards with generic messages. "Daddy never came to my dance recitals," Charity announced to Camille one evening, her 8-year-old honesty cutting through the adult pretenses. "But Mama Jennifer came to every single one. She even helped make my costumes." Camille's attempts to dismiss these revelations only highlighted her inadequacy. "Well, your father was working hard to provide for you," she'd say, but the children had seen the truth preserved in photographs and memories. Eric's phone calls to me became increasingly desperate. My new number remained unknown to him, but he tried every mutual friend, every family member, even my former colleagues. Each attempt met the same response. They hadn't heard from me, didn't know where I was, couldn't help him reach me. "She won't talk to me," he complained to his mother during one of his increasingly frequent visits. "How am I supposed to fix this if she won't even listen?" But I was listening to everything. Through my children's whispered phone calls, through Margaret's updates on his frantic legal maneuvers, through mutual friends who reported his growing desperation. My silence had become a weapon more powerful than any argument I could have made. The man who'd reduced me to extra luggage was discovering that he'd been living in luggage I'd packed, traveling on tickets I'd purchased, staying in hotels I'd booked. Every aspect of the life he'd taken credit for had been carefully constructed and maintained by the woman he'd dismissed as irrelevant. Late at night, Eric would sit in the house that was legally mine, surrounded by children who increasingly questioned his version of family history, living with a woman who'd discovered that his promises of financial security were built on foundations he'd never actually owned. My silence reflected back to him the truth he'd spent years avoiding. Without me, Eric Morrison was nothing more than an elaborate fiction, a character playing a role in a story someone else had written. And now the author had stopped writing his lines. Jeffrey appeared at my apartment door on a Thursday evening, his 16-year-old frame filling the doorway but his eyes holding the vulnerability of a much younger boy. Rain dripped from his hair and I realized he'd walked the 3 miles from his father's house in the storm. "Mom." His voice cracked on the single word and I saw years of suppressed emotion threatening to spill over. I opened the door wider and he collapsed into my arms like he used to when he was small and the world felt too big to handle alone. His shoulders shook as 16 years of confusion and loyalty finally found their breaking point. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he sobbed into my shoulder. "Why didn't you tell me what you gave up for us? What Dad really was?" I guided him to my small living room, this modest space that had become my sanctuary. He sat on my second-hand couch, looking lost and angry and heartbroken all at once. "You were a child, Jeffrey. I just wanted you to feel loved. I wanted you to have a father you could respect even if—" I paused, choosing my words carefully. "Even if that meant protecting you from difficult truths." "But I hurt you," he whispered. "All those times I chose him over you, all those times I didn't defend you. I was such a terrible son." "No." My voice was firm. "You were exactly the son I raised you to be. Loyal, loving, trusting. Those are beautiful qualities, sweetheart. Don't let his failures make you question your own heart." Jeffrey pulled something from his backpack. A worn composition notebook I recognized immediately. One of my journals from 3 years ago, filled with my private thoughts during some of our family's most challenging times. "Chase found this in a storage box Dad forgot about," he said, his fingers tracing the cover. "Mom, I read about the night I broke my wrist at baseball practice. You wrote about sitting in the emergency room for 6 hours holding my hand while I cried. You wrote about calling in sick to work the next day to take care of me, even though you couldn't afford to miss those hours." I remembered that night vividly. Eric had been at a business dinner, too important to interrupt for his injured son. I'd handled everything alone as usual. "You wrote about giving up the promotion at your job because it would have meant traveling, and you couldn't bear to be away from us more than you already were for Dad's career," Jeffrey continued, his voice breaking. "You wrote about selling your grandmother's ring to pay for Chase's football equipment when Dad said the budget was too tight. The ring had been my most treasured possession, a Victorian emerald that had been in my family for 4 generations. I'd never told anyone about selling it, had simply claimed I'd put it somewhere safe when Eric asked about it months later. I wrote those things down because I needed to remember why I was making those choices," I said softly. "Not because I wanted recognition, but because sometimes the sacrifices felt so big that I needed to remind myself they were worth it." Jeffrey looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "He told us you were weak, that you needed us to take care of you. But it was the opposite, wasn't it? You were taking care of all of us, even him." Before I could respond, my doorbell rang. Chase stood in the hallway, soaked and shivering, with Charity's small hand clutched in his. My youngest daughter's face was streaked with tears, her favorite stuffed animal, the one I'd rescued from their house, pressed against her chest. "We walked," Chase said simply. "Charity wanted her birthday with you." I had forgotten. In the chaos of separation and legal proceedings, I'd lost track of the date. Today was Charity's 9th birthday, and somehow my children had found their way to me. "Camille planned a party," Charity whispered, her small voice barely audible. "But she invited her friends, not mine. She bought a cake with flowers, but I hate flowers on cake. She got me a dress that's too big and the wrong color. Everything was wrong, Mama." I knelt to her level, my heart breaking at the defeat in her young eyes. "Oh, baby girl. I told them I wanted you," she continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I said it was my birthday and I get to choose, and I choose you. Dad got mad and Camille said I was being ungrateful, but Chase said we could come find you. So we left," Chase added, his 14-year-old voice trying to sound braver than he felt. "We just walked out. Let them try to stop us." I looked at my 3 children, drenched and defiant, and felt something shift in my chest. They had chosen me. Not because I'd asked them to, not because I'd manipulated or pleaded, but because they finally saw the truth of what our family had really been. "Are you going to make us go back?" Jeffrey asked, his question holding years of fear. "Never again," I said, and meant it with every fiber of my being. "Not unless you want to." Charity launched herself into my arms, her small body fitting perfectly against mine like she'd never left. Chase followed, then Jeffrey, and suddenly we were a tangle of arms and tears and relief in my tiny living room. "I'm sorry, Mama," Charity whispered against my neck. "I'm sorry I forgot how much you love us." "You didn't forget, sweetheart. You were just confused for a while. That's not your fault." "We're not going back," Chase said, his voice stronger now. "We want to stay with you. All of us." I held my children close, feeling their heartbeats against mine, and realized that my silence had accomplished something no argument ever could have. It had given them space to see clearly, to choose freely, to come home to the love that had never wavered. My silence hadn't been punishment or manipulation. It had been protection. Protection for them to discover their own truth, and protection for me to preserve what remained of my heart. Now, with my children choosing to return to me, that heart felt whole again. The eviction notice arrived at Eric's door on a Tuesday morning in October, exactly 3 months after my children had walked through the rain to choose their truth. I learned about it from Margaret, who'd been monitoring the legal proceedings with professional satisfaction. "He's lost the house," she informed me over coffee, her voice carrying no triumph, only factual completion. "The mortgage payments stopped when you froze the accounts. He couldn't prove ownership because, well, he never actually owned it." I stirred my coffee slowly, watching the cream swirl into patterns that dissolved as quickly as they formed. And Camille? Gone. Disappeared the moment his credit card started getting declined. Apparently, she'd been job hunting since the resort incident. Found herself a pharmaceutical sales manager in Phoenix. Left while Eric was at his brother's house begging for a loan. The house that had been our family home for 8 years now sat empty, its windows reflecting nothing but sky. Eric had been forced to move into a studio apartment across town, the kind of place college students rented when their parents stopped sending money. His BMW had been repossessed, replaced by a 10-year-old Honda with a dented bumper and a temperamental engine. Meanwhile, my children and I had created something entirely different. I'd purchased a small 3-bedroom ranch house in the next school district, close enough for the kids to maintain their friendships but far enough to establish our new beginning. It wasn't grand or impressive, just honest wood floors, clean white walls, and windows that let in morning light without pretense. "Mom, can we paint my room purple?" Charity had asked on our first day, her 9-year-old eyes bright with possibility. "Any color you want, sweetheart." We painted together that weekend, all 4 of us. Purple walls with silver stars that we applied one by one while music played from Jeffrey's phone. Chase accidentally got paint in his hair and we laughed until our stomachs hurt. Simple moments that felt revolutionary after years of walking on eggshells around Eric's moods. The boys shared the larger bedroom not because we couldn't afford better, but because they'd chosen to. "We've got catching up to do," Jeffrey had explained. 16 years of real conversations. I converted the garage into my home office, where I rebuilt my consulting practice using the business connections Eric had never realized were originally mine. Clients who'd respected my work but dealt with Eric because of his aggressive self-promotion now called me directly. My phone rang constantly with opportunities I'd forgotten existed. "Jennifer, we've been hoping you'd go independent," said David Chin, a former client who'd always made Eric nervous with his pointed questions. "Your husband's presentations were flashy, but we knew the real expertise came from you." 6 months passed before I composed Eric's final communication. It wasn't a letter exactly, but an accounting. A meticulous breakdown of every financial transaction I'd made on his behalf over 12 years of marriage. The document ran 37 pages, each entry carefully documented with dates, amounts, and purposes. $847,000 in mortgage payments for a house titled in my name. $124,000 in car payments for vehicles he'd driven like status symbols. $67,000 in credit card debt accumulated for his business lunches, golf memberships, and clothing designed to project success he'd never actually achieved. $43,000 in legal fees for business incorporations, patent applications, and contract negotiations he'd claimed as his victories. The numbers told a story Eric had never allowed himself to see. The story of a woman who'd sacrificed her own ambitions to build a platform for his ego, who'd worked tirelessly behind the scenes while he performed for audiences who were really applauding her efforts. But the financial accounting was only the beginning. I'd also included non-monetary contributions, 2,190 hours of unpaid administrative work for his consulting firm, 847 client dinners where I'd played the charming wife while actually steering crucial business conversations, 156 parent-teacher conferences attended alone because his schedule was always more important. The final page contained only 2 sentences. "My silence was never weakness. It was protection from you." I mailed the envelope on a Thursday, using certified delivery to his cramped apartment. According to the tracking information, he'd signed for it himself at 2:47 p.m. on Friday afternoon. He never responded. That weekend, while my children and I planted a vegetable garden in our backyard, Eric sat in his empty studio apartment reading and rereading the documentation of his hollow existence. Jeffrey later told me that his father had called him, voice shaking, trying to explain or justify or somehow minimize what the numbers revealed. He kept saying you were being vindictive, Jeffrey reported during one of our evening walks around the neighborhood. But I read those papers, Mom. You weren't being mean. You were just being honest. Honesty can feel cruel to people who've been living in fantasy, I replied, watching Charity chase fireflies in our front yard. By December, Eric had stopped trying to contact us altogether. His weekly attempts to arrange visits with the children had dwindled to monthly, then disappeared entirely. The man who'd once demanded center stage in every family drama had finally learned the power of silence, not by choice but by consequence. On Christmas morning, as my children opened presents in our modest living room, Eric woke up alone in his studio apartment to the sound of upstairs neighbors arguing. The silence he'd once imposed on me had become his permanent companion, echoing through rooms that held no laughter, no warmth, no evidence that love had ever existed within those walls. I watched my daughter carefully arrange her new art supplies, my sons debate strategy for the board game they'd unwrapped, and realized that silence, wielded with purpose, had given us everything we'd never known we were missing. Eric's world had shrunk to the size of his understanding, small, empty, and profoundly quiet. Ours had expanded beyond measure. If this story of silent revenge had you hooked, hit that like button. My favorite part was when Jennifer quietly dismantled Eric's entire world from her hotel room while he thought she was just extra luggage. What was your favorite moment? The declined credit card? The kids choosing her? That final envelope of truth? Drop it in the comments below and subscribe for more stories.